Introduction to American Literature, Beginnings to 1700. This lecture is coming from the reading selection on pages 3 through 18 in your text. So this is an introductory section. We will have several sections on the time periods of American literature. So of course, again, this is from beginnings to 1700 and will encompass the first few authors that we're looking at. Be sure you're paying close attention to these introductory selections, that you're reading them, especially those of you who aren't as strong in American history, haven't maybe read a lot of American authors, because these backgrounds are going to give you the context in which our writers are writing. Okay, this course focuses on literature written by inhabitants of the land that's now the United States of America. So for the first part of this course, this means that the writers we study were actually citizens of other countries. Our selection will be primarily European. We'll be studying literature that spans from the colonial period to the Civil War. The colonial period began with Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492, and it lasts until the 1760s or 1770s, depending on which source you're referencing. For the purpose of this class, we're going to end the colonial period with 1765, which is the year of the first Stamp Act. This is about the beginning of the British misusing the colonies and creating discontent among the colonists. Some historians will select other dates, even leading up to the 1776 Declaration of Independence. After Columbus's discovery of the New World, Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, and Sweden began exploring there. England was a relative newcomer to the exploration of the New World. They were already a world power, and they did not see any easily transportable resources to profit their country, and they're also hesitant after the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. So the Roanoke colony had been established by Britain in 1585 and then later found abandoned. So it was never clear what happened, but because of that, they were reluctant to use people and resources that may not be sustainable in the New World. Another thing to remember about our study is that the discovery of the New World was not one-sided. We often talk about it in a one-sided type of way, but the and the Old World impacted each other. So as Europeans discovered the New World, the cultures of the New World and the Old World collided and impacted each other. So for instance, the immigrants of European descent came with their own cultures and languages, but the new country changed those cultures, whether that's through interaction with Native American cultures, or that they had new professions and new ways of life. So to survive in the New World took different professions, and it wasn't an established culture. So some of the professions from the Old World didn't really have a fit in the New World. Or also through a lack or slow correspondence with the European culture. So they would have to send letters by ship all the way back to the Old World. The replies would take months. And so by the time that sometimes they received a reply or instructions, the event about which they were writing was over in the New World. So Europe maybe didn't have as much of an impact as we might have thought. So these changes create a culture that is distinctly American, and that's why we start our American literature with the colonies, even though technically speaking, those writers were of European nationality at that time. One thing about this course is we're not going to directly look Native American literature. It is important to note that some literature has been preserved dating previous to 1492. However, it's important to consider that Native American literature would not have been classified as literature in the colonial times. Because in the colonial times, they took a very literal opinion of literature. So talking about the Latin root of our English word literature, the Latin is litera, meaning letter, and it indicates a written form. So literature at that time in the colonies denoted that it was a written literature, and the Native Americans had an oral, not a written literature. So it's not until about the 18th and 19th century Romantic period that the concept of literature would expand to include literature of an oral medium. Okay. In colonial America. So early explorers, they would write promotional literature to persuade others to come to the New World. They discussed the surroundings and the occupations available. People began to think of the New World as a place of unbounded opportunity and were very optimistic about it. Um, the printing press was active in many areas of America, including the following: Cambridge, Massachusetts, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis. While these places only printed about 250 different items from 1696 to 1700, they had a distinct advantage over England, where printing was restricted by law to 4 places: London, York, Oxford, and Cambridge. So therefore, the American colonies had the chance to become a cultural leader in printed literature. So it's interesting because they weren't printing a lot because there was not a lot of American literature to print at that time, but they had the freedom to print what they chose where they chose, whereas the laws were more restrictive in England. All right, next I want to talk to you about 2 terms, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And these groups are actually distinct and separate at the beginning of the colonization in America, but they basically merge in meaning by about 1691. So that's why it can be confusing to us today. When we talk about the American Thanksgiving, we often interchange the term Pilgrim and Puritan. But when they originally colonized America, these were 2 different groups. So I wanted to explain these to you. Puritans were people who are willing to work within the established Church of England, and Pilgrims thought that the Church of England was too corrupt and wanted to separate from it. So Puritans are still Anglicans. Pilgrims are withdrawing from the Anglican Church, so you might hear them called separatists. They want to separate from the Anglican Church. So these 2 groups have different influences in the New World, but I just wanted you to see the difference. Theologically speaking, they are very similar, and we'll talk about their beliefs later when we get to some of the Pilgrims and Puritans. But again, theologically, they're a lot the same, but the Puritans want to use those theological ideas to change the established church, and the Pilgrims want to use those ideas to break away from the church. Okay, English settlement. Let's talk about the reason, because I told you that was reluctant to settle the New World, but of course they did. So let's talk about why. They decided to settle the New World for several reasons. The first is simple patriotism. If any of you have interacted with the British, they are a very proud culture. They're proud of their nationality. They're proud of their uniqueness. So here's most of the European countries colonizing the New World, and England is left out. So one reason is just simply patriotism. Number 2 is their needs as a seafaring people. Again, if you are familiar with England, you know that it is a very small country. It is an island, and so they have agricultural and other needs that require some more land and space and farming area, so they can do this in America. And number 3, just longing for land and wealth. It was very profitable to be in the New World at this time. Okay, so permanent English settlements. I talked to you about the Roanoke, the failed colony, but let's talk about the first English settlements that were permanent and successful. Number 1 is Jamestown, which was founded in 1607 in modern-day Virginia, and the second is Plymouth in 1620, which is in modern-day Massachusetts. So I'm going to talk to you about the differences between these 2 and which groups of people settled these 2. So Jamestown, first of all, was settled primarily for economic reasons. Its colonists were mostly Anglican. They came over in 3 small ships, and the journey took 5 months. There were about 140 men and boys on the journey to Jamestown, but 40-ish of them were the crew. So we see about 100 original male settlers. Now, of these 100 original Jamestown men, 59 were what were called gentlemen. And these are men that were wealthy, of the upper class. They're unaccustomed to hard work and taking orders. And so an interesting thing about this colony is that the colonists almost starved the first few winters and later were almost wiped out by Indians. And in part that has to do with the fact that the majority of the men were not kind of the rough laborers. They were gentlemen. They weren't accustomed to hard work. They weren't ready to create an established settlement by themselves, and so they really struggled some of the first few years. All right, as far as Plymouth goes, this is not primarily economic, it's primarily founded for religious freedom. It was settled by Puritans, most of whom were poor and less educated than the Jamestown colonists. They came over in two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, although the Speedwell was leaky and had to turn back. Between 1628 and 1640, 25,000 people, most of whom were Puritans, settled in the Plymouth and Massachusetts area, which made this area have a cultural and educational edge on Jamestown. However, by the end of the 1600s, we'll see Jamestown kind of taking that lead back because of tobacco production at that time. All right, I wanted to end this lecture with some statistics from this time to kind of give you a picture of the huge amount of growth that's happening here. So we started this period of American literature and American history with colonization when there were no statistics as far as who was there. Of course, the Native American tribes were there, but when we're talking about European colonists, we're going from 0 in 1492 to 250,000 by 1700. And then to show you a glimpse into the future, by 1765, 1.75 million people in America. As far as slavery goes, by 1700 there are about 25,000 slaves. When we're looking at the same time difference, there's about 325,000 by 1765. One interesting fact is that there were slaves in all of the original colonies, although most of them were south of Pennsylvania. We talk about, North versus South as we were looking forward to the Civil War, but slavery was existent in all of the original colonies. Initially, few voices were raised against slavery. I know it becomes a polarizing issue later in American history, but at this point, there was not a whole lot of debate about slavery. There are several reasons for that, and I'm going to give them to you. Not that we agree with these in any way, but I'm giving you the rationale at that time for why slavery was accepted. First, some people use the Bible as justification, the examples of slavery in the stories of the Bible, and so they justified it as a practice at that time. Second was a description of the slaves as happy with their station. Some of the writing that was being done depicts slaves who are content, and so there's no reason to change that. Number three, there was an idea among some scientists that there was biological inequality between the races. And number four, the idea that slaves were rescued from pagan cultures and converted. So some people tried to use a missionary mindset as justification for slavery. Well, yes, we have them in slavery, but they are in a Christian culture instead of in a pagan culture, so that is justified. All right, so this whole lecture again is the context in which your first authors that we're going to read are writing. So you need to know some of the history so that you can understand when and why they are writing. All right, thanks.